So, greetings to all. This is our sixth seminar session. We're still with this book on the cosmic mystery of Jesus Christ. We're moving on to the Philokalia next time. The Philokalia. The Maximus selections in the Philokalia are extensive. But this time we're looking at Ad Thalassium 61 on the legacy of Adam's transgression, and also Ad Thalassium 64 on the prophet Jonah and the economy of salvation. So that's our marker. Now, David, please, you go ahead. What's on your mind? How would you like to begin us?
Well, what I thought I would do
David,
is
go. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Oh, David Jennings. Oh, well, there was a mix-up with the Davids. David Jennings, will you hold on 1 minute and David Goa starts, or David Goa, would you hold on 1 minute and David Jennings starts? You decide between you two.
Oh, well,
David Goa, maybe you go because that's what I expected.
Yeah.
Well, but I'm not living up to your expectations. How sad is that might
As you please.
Yeah.
Proceed.
Yeah, go ahead. Jennings.
Me? Okay. But I won't be just a minute, I suspect. But, you know, remember, my profession gets paid by the minute. So
You go on. Yeah.
old habits die hard. So what I thought I would do is just simply walk through what I think the basic argument is, and then emphasize what I think are some interesting key theological arguments that he's making, and then ask a couple of questions coming out of those. So I thought I'd just sort of set that. So obviously, I take it that everyone has read it, and that this is a lengthy response to a question about 1 Peter 4:17-18 that deals with both that the judgment of the house of God is to begin, and then secondly, what that's going to look like for the impious and the sinner. And so it's quite I think a wonderfully thorough theological background before he finally gets to answering those questions. So I think this extended analysis is really one about original sin, as we commonly refer to it, and of the efficacy of Christ's passion and the implications of that. The argument starts with the point that originally we humans were not made with either concept of pleasure or pain. We did have the spiritual capacity for pleasure, but only in enjoying God and being obedient to his will. Through Adam, though, we squandered this capacity, and I'm throwing in language that's in the document, happy to talk more about it. Squandered this capacity. We sought pleasure through our senses that wasn't related to enjoying or God or fulfilling his purposes. And God, concerned about our salvation, affixed pain into our lives as a punitive measure to thwart our ill-conceived desire for pleasure. The ultimate conclusion of this pleasure, which gave rise to pain, is death, which Maximus calls just, and that's the end of it, the end or the purpose of our sufferings and pain, or the consequence of our sufferings and our pain, which again are the consequences of our seeking pleasure of the senses. The death that we are describing that comes from this pleasure of the senses that then results in pain and suffering is a death that condemns human nature itself. then there's a discussion about how Christ reverses all of this, that Christ life refutes both the pleasure of the senses as well as the unjust seeking of the pleasure of the senses, as well as the consequential just suffering and pain. And I'll just make that point a little bit more. And then ultimately, the death that he suffers is not the just conclusion of that, but in fact is unjust. But by doing so, Christ reverses the whole process, not just for himself, but for all of humanity. Christ was not born of unrighteous pleasure. I enjoy reading a monk telling us about the unrighteous pleasure of sexual union. And by not being born of unrighteous pleasure, but by a virgin birth, he was able to negate that aspect of our fall. As well, because of that, he doesn't suffer, he does not suffer justly any sufferings or pain, but it isn't righteous to have him suffer or for him to die. It's both just unjust and uncaused because of his life. But what is said, and we'll get back to this, is that it was necessary that such suffering occur so that human nature could be set right. The unrighteous pleasure was reversed by virgin birth. The righteous pain and suffering, a consequence of such pleasure, did not arise in God's life, so it was unjust in his case. And the death, as I said, was unjust as well. There's a lovely phrase, I think, in here on page 135, I think. Is it that he says this? He says that it is, yes, for having given our human nature impassibility through his passion, remission through his toils, and eternal life through his death, he is restored in the human nature. So this is the necessity of that we have been told about. And just a reminder, passibility, at least as I understand it, is not about culpable sin for which we are all responsible, but consequential sin, the suffering that occurs through that. And that to be human in the fall means that we suffer, that we have passibility, corruptibility, and mortality. All of those are reversed by Christ and his death. Let me see. Yeah, by Christ having reversed that, there is a new beginning and there is a second nativity for human nature. Now, suffering for those who have experienced the new beginning and the second nativity being born again, we now experience suffering now for the pleasure of eternal life. So it reverses that pleasure precedes pain. Now it is suffering and pain precedes the pleasure of eternal life. This converts the use of death. Before, death was to condemn human nature. Now Christ uses that very same death to condemn sin. The destruction of sin, which causes the fear of death, is now the purpose of death itself. We can condemn sin if we are born in the Spirit, because no longer is our death a result of our pleasure and then just pain, but rather our suffering is from unjust suffering and pain and gives rise to the pleasure of eternal life. And by doing so, we condemn sin. Christ condemns sin, and then we condemn sin. This is, I think, is a fair summary of the entire text. There is a distinction between the impious and the sinner, and why, if it's going to be bad for the pious person, why it's going to be, the question is asked by Peter, what about the impious and the sinner? And Maximus talks about that without necessarily the conclusion. I think in the positive sense, what he speaks of is the pious person will enjoy the deification without origin, or the deification of being illuminated with Christ, or with, well, Christ, but the entire Trinity's divinity that doesn't have any origin, but is a revelation for those who are worthy of it. So I think that that's a fair summary. I'm happy to pause now, but maybe I'll just ask the questions, because this is what I found interesting. When Maximus was talking about why it was necessary for Christ to reverse this by way of a virgin birth, by way of unjust suffering, and by way of a death that was unjust because of that, the question I had, and he repeats that it was necessary several times, but he doesn't explain why it was necessary. Now, you have to take it in the corpus of all of his writings, but I thought it would be an interesting question with respect to Maximus's theology, whether it was necessary for God, out of some immutable understanding of justice, that it was necessary that God have this occur, or whether it was God's graciousness, understanding our sin-stained understanding of justice, that required this reversal, because otherwise we would not, as humans, fallen humans, be willing to accept the grace that is offered to us. So I think that's a question I would like to at least discuss, or have someone discuss who's competent to discuss it. The second thing is a smaller thing, but I wonder how much of his argument, he makes a lot of it, but I'm not sure it's actually necessary for his argument that the pleasure precedes pain, and that pleasure, the unrighteous pleasure, is that of sexual union. That is, it's taken to its maybe a silly extreme on the opposite way. Would it be more acceptable to Maximus that we all were in vitro fertilization rather than born out of unrighteous pleasure, which he's making that distinction between that and a virgin birth. So I don't think, from my reading, or my perhaps it's just my own theology or my warped theology, I don't see what turns on the idea that sexual union is unrighteous pleasure. I think the same issue of the fall, of sin, how we have all fallen short, and Christ's response to all of that is equally valid, even if one doesn't place such heavy emphasis on the unrighteous pleasure of sexual union. But I'd be interested in hearing that. As a Protestant, we tend to shy away from that, so I'm happy to be educated a bit more on that. The other thing at the very end, and it might be getting towards deification issues that I know I'm still wrestling with, but the once and for all nature of Christ's reversal of sin, of death, and then the condemnation of sin, at least in my reading of Maximus, is that he still sees an important role for each of us to be in perfect righteousness to condemn sin. That there's some efficacious role that we have in that. And I query whether or not we need to be efficacious in that, or we affirm what Christ has already done for us, rather than be agents of that condemnation of sin that still exists. That isn't to argue that therefore our actions don't matter. When I read it, I mean, it was interesting in the last page, I thought that Maximus, thought set a standard I don't know any human who has ever met when dealing with the impious and the sinner. But he does then say, making the distinction, he said, the sinner, the one who has faith, but like me, transgresses the gospel commandments, which keep clean the tunic of incorruptibility given us through holy baptism. I mean, it's not that Maximus had an ego thinking that he was without corruption, but if Maximus is acknowledging that even in himself that's the case, and the saints always think they're the most simple of all, but I'd be interested in hearing that play out. That is, if one continually sins, does that mean that the promises of Christ's reversal are somehow contingent on not belief, not faith and assertion, but on actual practices? So with that, I turn it over to those who have a better understanding of all this. But I think that, and if there's any clarification, I'm happy to at least give it my shot.
Thanks, David. Done like a superb lawyer. Perfect. Nicely laid out. And your the three themes that you raised for us to think about. The first one about, was it necessary for God? Or is that necessity for human beings? It's a curious, our language is so curious, isn't it? Because on the one hand, Maximus would argue, as many others, that there is no necessity in God.
Yeah.
Necessity is something that we as human beings know. At the same time, because he sees God as creator, sustainer, and lover of the world, the incarnation is not done out of necessity, it's done out of love.
Yeah.
So maybe it's simply a question of intention and motivation there.
Yeah.
And the rest of you can comment on that too. I'll just make a comment about each one of these a little bit. The issue of pleasure and the way sexual union is described here. I've been, over the last several texts, I've been pondering that. Gregory of Nyssa, who he draws on here, can be read even in more extreme ways by suggesting that sexual union only came about after the fall. This notion that if the fall had not occurred, there would be human reproduction, but it wouldn't take place this way. We'd be born out of our father's ears or something like that. But I have another thought on this, and I'd be interested in all your reflections on this. We have to remember that these are monks that are speaking. That doesn't mean they haven't had sexual relations. We have to remember that they're preoccupied with human passions, human suffering. And the suffering is really endemic to sin. So I would suggest to you that this, I wish we could find the right words for this. My sense is that the opposite of communion is concupiscence. And that what they're really pointing to here isn't about sex, or I could put it another way. There's a huge difference between sex and loving and lovemaking. And that, because it's also interesting in the Orthodox tradition, the Orthodox tradition is very much like the Jews in that it's pretty celebratory of human union and human communion. In fact, it's fair to say that in Orthodox theology associated with things like marriage, lovemaking is a form of communion. Mm-hmm. It's the most visceral form of communion. So my sense is that when they speak this way, I think we have to step back and say, what's the intent here? And my sense is the intent is not to become a Gnostic about the body and about the sexual life, because there were endless arguments about that. But it is a clear sense of how easy it is for the desire, the sexual desire, to be motivated out of selfishness instead of simply the arising of love between two people. So and then maybe another distinction would be between pleasure and joy. That when he speaks about pleasure, the opposite of that isn't pain, but it's joy. Pleasure is linked to passion, to sin, precisely because it is born out of appetite and not out of love and communion. So what do you think of that? Is that?
Maybe I should let others, but let me just quickly, I couldn't agree more. And, we all know those couples who have struggled for a long time to have a child. And when they have that child, that child wasn't born out of an unrighteous pleasure, but years of prayer and, faithfulness and a desire for that type of communion. Likewise, adoption or otherwise, so I think you're doing it. I guess my concern was that he seemed to place so much emphasis on that to be able to make his theological argument that because pleasure precedes pain, which then precedes death, and Christ reverses that you had to get Christ back to a virgin birth, and that would have to be distinctive from our birth. And I just don't think that I don't think that's necessary for his argument. Christ absolutely reverses our life, our fallen nature. But I don't think we have to place whether or not our parents, for some of us, the mother was raped and never knew the father. On others, it was years of prayer. For some, it would be in vitro fertilization, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that's theologically where we need to turn to. As much as I believe in the virgin birth, I want to, emphasize that, like the literal virgin birth. I don't see that as the key, the hermeneutical key for seeing the reversal that Maximus touches on. And I think you're absolutely right that joy is very different than pleasure. We're told to have joy in all circumstances, for example. So it can't be a pleasure-based thing, but it is born out of love and communion. So I understand that, but I just think, if I were advising them, because, Maximus would turn to me for theological insight, that I would say get rid of that, because I don't think it's key for it.
Let me say one thing. about the virgin birth. Because there's been so much ink spilt over this and such preoccupations with it. It seems to me to be kind of crude to think of something as precious to the gospel narrative as the virgin birth through the prism of, hymen intacta.
Perfect.
The whole notion of the virgin birth, this has a prophetic dimension to it, and that prophetic dimension is, at least in part, the critique of the way in which women were understood. Mm-hmm. Understood as being, as having their only real social reality was in connection with father or with husband. And also in the Jewish world, and I think it's fair for me to say that this is still the case in the Jewish world. And I have so much appreciation for Judaism and its way of putting the world together. But in my own time within the Jewish community and getting to know many of those people, it did become very vivid to me. It's similar in a sense among Hindus, that there is this very profound sense that if you are not married, you are not a full human being. If you don't have children, you are not a full human being. Now, saying a full human being may be extreme here, but for the sake of what I want to point to. So, virgin, I mean, there's, this, David, the rest of you know it as well. I mean, the word that's used for it probably just means a young woman. Yeah. And this idea developed for reasons that I think Maximus is pointing to here. But another way to think of virgin is that this is the state of non-concupiscence, that where all unions are communions.
Right. Wow.
Where all unions are communions. So there is no division. Did you want to dip in here, Andrew?
Well, I may. It's not necessary. I may. I had. I love what you just said, David, and I'm glad that it came round to virginity and to your accounting of it. And I think that the idea that communion is the opposite of concupiscence is good. I think that's really apropos.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent way of thinking about the issue that David Jennings brought up. I was thinking in another harmony to that. This text seems to me to turn around slightly ambiguous terms. One of those terms, or two of those terms, I think are unfortunate in English. Just, which David Jennings brought up, just death, justice, this kind of thing. And another one that was also brought up immediately that David Goa addressed, necessity, right? And I couldn't have put it better myself, what David Goa said about necessity. We do not accord it to God. It's foreign to what we understand to be. But it is a framework for understanding humanity, perhaps. Now, but I wanna back up a little bit, maybe, or something. If the virgin birth is not about physicality, but it's about what I think is one of the main distinctions in this text here, in on the legacy of Adam's transgression, which is a word and its shadow, as it were, a word and its shadow. So we have one word, life, in English, and by it we mean variously biological life or kind of spiritual life, you know. And Maximus is with it. Sometimes we can. Greek has bios, biology, mortal life, and zoe, the spiritual life, right? And I like to think that Christ's virgin birth means that. And David Jennings, you brought this up with the new arche, the new beginning, the new genesis, the new coming into being, right? It seems that we might understand it that Christ was born outside the confines of mortal life, by which we mean outside the spiritual confines, fear of death, concern about, let's say, extension of power, unconcern with self-preservation and, you know, self-assertion, all these things that we might tend to, that David Goa nicely calls appetites. If the virgin birth, you know, its life is more purely of Zoe, also mortal.
Andrew, pardon me.
Yeah.
But
yeah. No, go on.
I lost part of your sentence there. You seem to be going boom, 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 or something like that. Maybe you need to sit a little closer to the microphone. I'm not.
No,
sure.
I think it's internet connection, David.
Okay. All right.
Heavens above. It might be a. Well, I'll repeat that. So, when Christ is born of the virgin birth, right? It is an entrance into Zoe, spiritual life, the appropriate life for human beings. Most of us think that life means biological life, the mortal coil, where we are constantly trying to fend off death or extend ourselves or what have you. If we recenter that into, you know, spiritual life as being the determining element, that seems more appropriate. It seems more appropriate, right? And appropriate. Now, the word just and justice in terms of weights and measures, you know, something has a deficit, needs to be regained, or an error has been committed, it has to be rectified by some kind of, you know, pleasure, punishment, that kind of thing. But if justice is meant to be understood as kind of a restoration of a healthy order of things, it means what is appropriate, that which is appropriate. That which is just means not good and evil and reward, that which is appropriate to something. Now, what's appropriate to mortal life is birth and death. What's appropriate to intimate communion, as David Goa laid out nicely, is lovemaking, to use your term, not just, you know, fornication, not just, you know, the beast with two backs, as Shakespeare. So we're talking about a clarification of kind of theme or thesis word here. That's where I'd come into it from. And one question I had for you, David, around this text, and David Jennings, and then also Lorraine and Michael, add in as you will. David Jennings, you thought deeply about this text. David Goa, you have too. We all have, but David Goa, I'm wondering what happens when we mistake.
You've broken up a little bit, Andrew.
It's okay, I'll repeat myself. It's not a problem. What happens when we mistake mortal life as bios, for spiritual life as Zoe? And then also, what happens when we mistake one of those two, mortal life, spiritual life, for existence, what Maximus calls existence? And here, David Goa, I want to come back to a comment you made several times to me. You brought it up last time in our last session, where you said you would, if sin wasn't somehow a metaphor for experience, right? Which would make this language of just, necessity, condemn, strange. And I think it should make it strange. If sin isn't a metaphor for a euphemism, you said, for experience. But more deeply, I want to ask you, what happens when we mistake life, bios, for life, bios, for existence, right? And that existence you've characterized as trying to lessen the distance between misstep and awareness and repentance, metania, metanoia, metania, around the nous, the nia that we've been looking at, the meta, change of mind means repentance, and the company. Because it seems to me that when we mistake life for life, then we are suffering under an illusion. We're acting not for the sake of the divine, but for the sake of something else, usually ourselves, usually our own autonomy. Nomos, law, is a word which will come up later. Our own self-law, our own self-governance. That's what often happens when we mistake life for life. We refocus on ourselves. But the two make of, and David Jennings too, and then also extending to Michael and Lorraine. If we think in this term, following David Jennings' introduction and David Gore, your comments, please.
Our existence, or the way he uses that term, the kind of choices we make, the existential choices we make, can actually be bios or Zoe. And we don't know. We don't know. Because we aren't God. Because we are particular. And so that's what I meant by my little comment about how experience is a euphemism, or sin is a euphemism for experience. That is, there's some kind of decision and choice that's made. There are things that can be affirmed in that and things that can be denied in that. And we don't know until we do it, until we enter in. And that's why Christianity isn't a moral religion. It's about transfiguration, and it has at its center forgiveness, because there's no way we can know it. So in the way in which you've used bios here and Zoe here, Zoe in the way in which Maximus uses it, I mean, Zoe as, well, it's life with the large L. It is what is real, as opposed to the way you've used bios here, which is, tied to one's particularity in one's, and often even in light of our conversation so far, one's what can so easily be one's appetites. So when we existence, at least if I've understood how he's used that, is that unfolding, which is life, in which the presence of the Holy Spirit, to use the lovely language of the tradition, the spirit that makes things whole, is all that is there. And as a result, whatever it is one encounters, or whatever that moment of existence is, it has its own kind of fullness. And it's because it's given. It's given. I mean, that's the other element here, I think. Zoe is always given. It rises to meet us. And our decision, our action, our thought, what we do or what we fail to do, we will discover something about that in the midst of that encounter. And the whole point of asceticism and the spiritual disciplines, it seems to me, is to help free us enough from our own appetites, our own memories, our own ideals, so that we actually can recognize and experience the joy of those moments of communion.
And the incarnation needs to mean that the Zoe refuses to be Zoe without the bios. But the bios is,
Right.
at least in our human nature form, until at least the Passion of Christ, had to deal with the passibility issue of that we suffer the consequence of sin, even of course the culpability of sin, but for Christ himself. But now Zoe, I would think Zoe refuses any concept of spirituality, like a Gnostic type of spirituality, that doesn't embed in it the bios, because it is good. It was created for good. And as we struggle through our appetites until we get to 1 Peter 4:17-18, where we can suffer not because of our appetites, but suffer for Christ, that's when we are in our bios, we are in our Zoe.
Nicely said. Yeah.
Twofold, right? He's defined that one is kind of suffering as being given into the pleasures, but also the suffering of just of being more of what you're talking about, David Jennings, the integration and tension, because they belong together in our life, so far as we understand. The bios and the Zoe, they're not separate. They can't be. Otherwise, like you both have said, Gnosticism or some kind of abstract.
You're very low.
I think now it's not your internet. I think it's your earpiece. Your sound is really low. Yep. Wow, in a conversation like this, being designated the host is a lot more metaphorically important than normal.
Very careful. Yeah.
Okay, pardon me, all. I
That's
tried
better.
to arrange it so that I would be heard and I could hear and everything, and then I signed myself out. Pardon me.
That's all right.
I had a point here that I thought was important. The distinction between suffering as giving into appetite and so on, and what they call ponos, suffering as in the footnote, it says suffering as part of, our mortal coil, what we undergo. First of all, I think this is what the Russians mean by suffering when they say salvation through suffering. They mean salvation through enduring and joining together the mortal and the spiritual. Lord have mercy on me. David, I had a question for you and I lost it, and then I had it and then I got cut out and then I lost it. It'll come back. very shortly, and it has to do with this. Yes, here it is. If the sinner, the impious person, won't learn through encounter, because what you've been talking about, David Go, just now, has been very much in encounter, right? With another, I open up in this way, I learn in this way, so on and so forth. Do you care to turn to the end of this, to page 142, 143? So we think a little bit about this whole idea of where, because David Jennings, he alluded to this and discussed it briefly at the beginning, but at the end, all of a sudden, the strange, it's almost strange, a strange inquiry. Where are they going to be found? Where are they? Where's the sinner? Where's the impious? Right? Sinner, we know, doesn't mean someone who does ill work. It means someone who's wayward. And the impious person maybe doesn't know how to appropriately be as a human being, which is to be in a position of worship. But regarding encounter, David, you've thought a lot about this. Encounter, it it's related to a key theme of yours, presence. And then in this last page and a half, when Maximus says, where are they to be found? And he more or less says, the topos, the place, he uses the word topos, of salvation is Jesus Christ. If someone separates themselves from Jesus Christ, there is no place there. But then he says that's cataphatic, that's translated as affirmative. Yeah. He says the apophatic, which is poorly translated as negative over at the end of 143, says, but why are we talking about where? God, of course, is beyond location. There's nothing but the presence of God. Mm-hmm. So David, where were you and Jennings and Lorraine and Michael too? I mean, but where are you seeing this? How does this measure? If I'm saying in this state, there's no place, they seem lost, right? No matter if you speak cataphatically or apophatically. Pardon me.
Yeah, would you repeat the last sentence, Andrew? You broke up.
Yeah, of course. There seems to be no, let's say, healthy place, location for the impious or the sinner in this topographical way of thinking, right? Which Maximus, I like it personally, and I've introduced it before, but he uses it here. I didn't know, but he uses it here. So when you're thinking of encounter seems kind of occasional. It's an occasion. It's given a certain, chronotopical time and place, right? Is that related to Maximus's pondering, his meditation on the whole idea of God and place and the presence of God? It seems to me connected somehow. It's like, it's the presence of God, but the presence of God is the only location there is, but it's also beyond all location, because location doesn't even have a reason to be in the same sentence as the word God. It's shaky, but it's inchoate thinking. Or what did you make of this? If you didn't make something of this and you wish to point elsewhere, let's do that too. But I'm curious if you did make something of this.
Well, as we pray in the liturgy, that beautiful opening to the liturgy, who is everywhere present and fillest all things.
Yeah.
Weary of every good and giver of life, come and abide with us. This isn't the problem God has, it's a problem we have. It's that abiding problem. Mm-hmm. It's whether or not I am drawn into, well, let me put it another way. From every encounter we have in life, the whole what we greet, what greets us in life of the most ordinary kind is holy, is God, if we but see it. But it's not God separate from the bios.
Exactly.
It's God incarnate. It's unfolding in all things, everywhere present, and fillest all things. So, I mean, it is interesting to me how this ends with a couple of questions. Let me refresh my memory in case, I mean, all of you got photographic memories. So. Either way, how will he exist when he does not have God as his location itself? The only sure foundation of well-being, which is in God. Simply stated, if after much vexation, the righteous man will be saved, what will there be? Or what will become of the one who gives no account of piety or virtue in the present life? We'll be picking up on this, I think, in the next text.
Exactly.
And on Maximus's whole notion, I have to be careful how I put this, and I hope that Michael will unwrap all this for us. The whole notion that there is no being in non-being. And that's why it's a tragedy when people, for whatever reason or however it comes about, no longer have a capacity or are open for communion, for recognizing what is, for living in the world, in reality, but have stepped outside of it. But maybe I'm missing what you're driving at, Andrew.
Can I just add,
that's good. Yeah, of course. Jennings, go on.
I would just add, you know, like I think that Emmanuel means exactly that God is with us, and so there is always a where in that I don't want to lose sight of, whether it's Peniel or Moriah or Zion or Bethlehem,
Or Nineveh.
Or Nineveh, exactly. Thank you. I mean, yeah, thank you. So I found the argument around the where. I thought it was. It's not that I understood the argument, and I thought it was useful, but it was a secondary to the key one. But I thought that it would have been better. Listen to me, like the arrogance, but I would have found it better if the argument around where dealt with that God chooses to be where, that the incarnation is saying where, as well as a whole lot of other theological things it answers. It does reassert that where matters, that place matters.
Indeed, David, but to recognize where it happens, that's risky. I think that's where I take him to be cautious. The recognition, the according. Pardon me.
Right, and so that's the other part of the Emmanuel. It's God with us, so there's the where. But what I think Maximus is emphasizing is us recognizing God there. And so where matters, but the impious and the sinner who have fallen off, you know, what's the line in Dante at the beginning? You know, the gone through the wood and the unrighteous path, or I can't remember how he calls the path, but those of us who have fallen off that path, the where is now not recognized, and the where is not recognized for the impious and sinner to be with Christ. So I think that that's the other part of Emmanuel, is that where matters, but the where only matters insofar as both that we recognize that Christ is there. And in the impious and the sinner, we are in a spot where we're not recognizing that.
I just had a thought about this when you consider who he's doing this for. I mean, one of the struggles I think of monks, of monastics, is they can easily divide up the world around those of us who are ascetics, and we are constantly engaged with God in our cell, and then there's the world. So I wonder, I mean, I should bear that in mind when I reread it again. I wonder if part of what he's doing here is it's a throwaway line, you know, to the monks, to prompt them to think a little more clearly, and to not assume that where is simply their cell and only their cell.
It's against an idolatry. And I agree with you, David. It's against an idolatry of place.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That seems to me precisely what it's about. It's against the temptation towards an idolatry of place, i.e., here in Egypt, God is here. God's not in Turkey. God's here, or not in Russia, or not in Canada. It's the danger of presuming all places are holy, but it's a danger of forgetting that, maybe.
Yeah.
But Lorraine, a little bit ago, you were going to say something, and then you backed off, and then you went forward, then you backed off. But pardon me if I'm putting you on the spot. You had something in mind a while ago. Does it still pertain? Would you like to?
Yeah.
Please go on.
I think just backing up. So I just did this question to David. Go in. Perhaps this is just so I can understand the importance of encounter. So rising up to meet, and that really is our disposition, right? That that ideally we want to be able to meet what comes to us. But I guess the question for me is then what is the appropriate stance to evil or privation, right? Because we're being asked to rise up and to welcome what is unfolding. But is there a connotation that unfolding is God? Like that, I mean, very loosely, that there's a good. Do we rise up and welcome the good? Do we also rise up and welcome the, like I say bad, but the privation? Or what's the appropriate stances if we are to rise up in unfolding?
That's beautiful. Sorry, I have to interject. That's a really beautiful. So go on, David.
Well, you were the one that used the word appropriate. So why don't you?
The word is yes, Lorraine. Yes, but David will say it better. But go on, David. The word is yes. You embrace all of it. But pardon me, David, go on, please.
I don't know that stance is the, well, let's just think about it a bit. There's lots of discussion about disposition. And what is the disposition of your mind and your heart? And the spiritual work is largely about coming to that place where you're, we'll be talking about this in the next one, I think, where your self-understanding of things, your even natural dispositions where those are no longer in command. They're no longer defining things. You're more open than that. But I really appreciate what you're saying, and I think it puts a finger on a very profound issue, which is the spiritual life is dangerous. I mean, that's what separates it from the simpler forms of the moral life, where you can live out the sort of natural forms. And I used to be quite critical of people that I thought were moralists until I realized how lovely it must be. So
You watch it here?
by this, I'm not meaning to say that there isn't something like good judgment and all that sort of stuff. But I think at the end of this is really speaking to that disposition of mind and heart, which, because it is empty, because you're not projecting or presuming, that there may be some possibility simply to respond in grace.
David, would there be a case there that because an encounter of sin, evil, whatever it is illusory, that is, that it's not real? Do you make a distinction of the encounter of that rather than an encounter with the real? Or do we, as it's unfolding, take the same stance, and that's a matter of discernment and judgment that comes later?
Would you repeat it, David?
Maybe Lorraine, if I've misunderstood the question, maybe you want to repeat it. But I think that the question I thought Lorraine was asking was, when we talk about encounter and the posture when things are to unfold before us, and how to approach that with humility, etc., that if it is not the good, it is evil, sin, other appetites, illusions, etc., is it that as we take the position there, if it's not reality,
right, you'll learn.
I guess the technical phrase for business guys like me, is it front loaded or is it back loaded? That is this something that one goes through the same process and through discernment later on realizes it was unreal? Or is there a posture that has a filter at the front end before you engage with it and encounter it? Does that make any more sense than the last way I phrased it?
I think it helps me.
Okay.
I mean, for this tradition, for Maximus and what have you, there is this notion that the first step along the path is to live the commandments. That is, there is an understanding that kind of sort of moral pathway is important in order to lead you somewhere. But what I also wonder about it is, or another, maybe it's a footnote to what you're saying, realizing that you have bought the illusion. Look at the Jonah text that we're also going to deal with. There's several different illusions there. Realizing that, because of your behavior, because of your action, because of your thought, your little gizmoi, that what you responded to was something that turns out not to be real. Well, that then becomes a revelation.
Right.
Because it unveils for you something that's going on inside of you.
Right. An apocalypse.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So in that sense, it's good.
Yeah.
It may be hard on you and others, but Lorraine, do you want to push this around a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very helpful. I love that idea being the possibility to respond in grace. I think the stemming place for my question was, again, thinking about working with my clients and trying to encourage them to embrace what is unfolding when what is unfolding is horrific, right? And so I think I was kind of playing with what David Jennings says, like, in that case, is there a different kind of disposition that we already start with, like, okay, we already know that this is unreal, this is horrific, versus we go through this and then we make a judgment at the end? Because I think I'm leery of this kind of sense of what often becomes, God has a purpose for everything, and he killed your child or made you go through genocide because God has a plan for that, like somehow that's going to magically make it better. So I mean, I love this idea of embracing what's unfolding, and I think that really is the call of the spiritual life. But I'm wrestling with how we then discern what should be embraced and what should not be, or should we just embrace everything? That's what I'm struggling with. And then I'm thinking in the back of my mind that clinical application of how does that then get translated for people without falling into these cliches or these sort of basic causalities that we sort of hold on to. Something's happened, therefore we have to attribute meaning to it, or so on. So I don't know if that I'm just to say that's where it's coming from. So I'm still playing with that.
This stance, Lorraine, you named it a stance right away. David, you backed away from that term. I don't quite agree, perhaps, with your backing away. Stance, because if we think of stance in terms of a steadiness, like we thought of it in several sessions ago, it is like a disposition. It's not what many people think of stance now as in, I have an answer, it's a blank wall of answers for whatever happens. Stamen, it means roots. It means your steady openness to it. And Lorraine, I wonder, I'm not as knowledgeable as others here, but I wonder if what David goes trying to get at here with this idea of stance or disposition, it's not deciding on the quality or the quantity or the depth or the height of what is being said. It is being present to the person saying it. Like with, look at any encounter of Jesus Christ, of our Lord, right? It was always intimacy, communion, presence, right? Here, not I'm decide about your story now or later, or I've already decided about your story, or I will later. It had nothing to do with the details of the suffering. In a sense it did, but in a sense it didn't. It had to do with the raw human being there in front, right? Like the Samaritan, right? No question about what happened. Care or presence. I wonder if that's a way to think about this front load, back load, deciding on the texture of what's being said. Encounter an encounter that makes someone not a sinner, or an encounter in which someone is not a sinner, is an encounter in which one is present there,
Mhm.
in which one is just there with another human being, just there, really there, regardless of what they say. Maybe.
Mhm.
Go on. Am I off?
No, not in my view.
So then the details are what Christ takes care of. That's what our prayer takes care of. That's what our Lord gathers and holds and heals and treasures and then binds us close. Just like our mortality. And he takes our mortality and says, no, this other thing, this Zoe, this true life is more important. Maybe in the encounter it's something similar. Your story is your story. I'm going to listen, but I'm not going to. It's not about the quality of your story. It's about this here now.
I would say that, I mean, there's a reason in the monastic tradition that it was always deemed appropriate for anybody who was stepping onto the path to have somebody that they talk with regularly, who was usually older, been around the block, the old man, as they call it in these texts. And that is all about, I think it's all about the development of discernment. But my sense is that is about the internal discernment. It's not about presuming and making judgments about other people. It's about figuring out what is it that's in oneself that makes judgments about other people. And so discernment is a huge piece of this spiritual tradition. In fact, I think it's fair to say it's virtually the huge piece.
Yeah.
But your question is and what you said is so poignant, because I know that you are talking with people who have trauma, and I often think that some of the Desert Father stories are really the ancient church's diagnostic manual. So some of those folks have had trauma, and that's what we're reading about, is how those traumas come, how they reshape the world. And in the hard cases, sometimes you're talking with someone like your clients are talking with you, who actually is able to help. But God knows how many times they weren't. They ended up wandering off into the desert and disappearing. So. Shall we?
It's one of the beautiful images of the desert, the wandering off. Yeah, let's move on, David. Let's move on.
Shall we move a little bit? And that was terrific, David. Thanks so much for that. Yeah.
Michael, I want to. David, do you mind if I walk into this?
Please.
Thanks, Michael. I want you to open it up. But this question of where, of topology, of kind of a location, something like that. I think it matters in this next text. My questions to you are, well, in general, to go to Jennings, to Lorraine, are is ekonomia, the economy of God, akin to energia in this text? And then the second question has to do with I'm not quite sure what to say, with placement, with gathering and dividing, with apportioning or arranging. This text works in kind of almost geometrical ways. But Michael, what did you read here? What did you hear? What did you think in the second? So we're on Ad Thalassium 64 on the prophet Jonah and the economy of salvation. Economy of salvation. Right? We've already brought up the idea of three. Economy. Well, I'm wondering if you thought about that word, or what else you thought about.
Well,
go on, Michael.
Okay. I mentioned at the outset before we started recording that it's all of us are familiar with this story, and it's there's different ways in which I think it can be trivialized without casting any aspersions. I know I haven't actually looked at his material, so I'm definitely not casting aspersions that Jordan Peterson often makes a good deal of this in a kind of potentially trivializing way, having Pinocchio go in and rescue his father from the whale and so forth. So I think it's quite striking when I came upon an utterly nihilistic vision borrowed from Job. And let me just quote from page 148, and this is in turn Maximus quoting from Job in his most darkly arresting vision of life. And it's quite striking because, as we know, Job never relented in his faith. And so that, in one sense, it's obviously wrong for me to characterize this vision as nihilistic, but it is because it's not Job's vision. It's rather his characterization of reality. So I'll quote just taken out of context, so this is a kind of nihilistic vision. The earth, the truly dark and gloomy earth, the earth of eternal darkness, that's the part that is drawing from Job, is like the depths of the deepest abyss. And that provides a good segue to something we were talking about a few minutes ago, because it seems to me that non-being in the worst, in the most profound sense, is a kind of abyss. And in one sense, I don't want to be, I'm not making a kind of Heideggerian point about the nothing exists or anything like this at all, just so you're not thinking in those terms. But it seems to me that openness to reality is a terribly difficult thing. And it's a difficulty that is quite inspiringly taken up by this text, owing to its extreme hermeneutic. I see a little blurb says your internet connection is, hopefully I'm coming through okay. It opens up Job partly through hermeneutic, a kind of hermeneutic virtuosity that stands in stark contrast to a kind of literalistic and containing way of looking at this terribly challenging story. So, as everyone knows, and I don't really have to capitulate the basic story, Job is charged with bringing a prophetic message to the people of Nineveh. And I think we're meant to be, and I'll just say this as a kind of heuristic going forward, we're meant to keep alive a lot of things in our brain at one time. You can't read this text in one way any more than you can read Maximus probably in one way. And so we're meant to keep alive a lot of things. So when we think of Nineveh, at every moment we should be, of course, thinking of ourselves. We should be thinking of the Jewish people. We should be thinking of the human condition. So when Jonah, who obviously, as we find out later in the text, has an excruciatingly intense animus against the Assyrians. Nineveh was the capital city at different times. Presumably it was the time Jonah was charged with going there and asking them to repent of their ways. What a horrible destiny for someone who obviously has some background story in his relation, which wouldn't be surprising because all of the neighboring peoples of the Assyrians had reason to be deeply distressed by Assyrian policy, just as the Assyrians, were in a state of anxiety with respect to their neighbors. Just like the Middle East today is a rough neighborhood, it was certainly rough back then. And so in one way, it's not surprising that we should have a kind of gloomy vision that comes out right at the forefront of this explication of this seemingly simple story. But it's not so simple, because the being swallowed by the whale, that's what it's meant to represent. It's not, or by the fish, it's not meant to represent just some bizarre, unaccountable thing that happens by analogy, and not by a single analogy, but certainly among the analogies that you can attribute to this fish that swallows Jonah and that instantly causes, more or less directly, causes him to begin to revise his own relationship with God, and to, from a heartfelt place, immediately pray for some kind of atonement. It's a place that all of us are dwelling in, and that is a rather gloomy thought. And so he's spit out from the fish, and you think, okay, here's a nice catharsis, a conclusion to this, just the beginning, because then he's charged with overcoming his apprehension and having to build up and help restore and regenerate through his words. That's not what he thinks is necessarily going to happen, though. The people whom obviously he feels a great animus towards. And so that's what happens. And then when, lo and behold, his prophetic words actually have an effect, he's distraught. It fills him with great anxiety and puts him on the outside of his relationship with God once again. And the narrative takes this weird twist. Who could come up with stuff like this? And then I'll sort of stop here, see if anyone has any comments, because his nose is out of joint, and this is a moment of kind of a awakening for him. He's helped to bring about an atonement for people for whom he feels no love, people with whom he's in a state of enmity. And now he's in a position where he has to also simultaneously bring out atonement for himself. So by analogy, he's both himself, the people of Nineveh, he's playing the role by anticipation, if you're a Christian, looking back at this with the ingenious hermeneutical imagination of Maximus, and the tradition at one with Christ, who's destined to bring a similar opportunity for atonement. But it's not a position that he's happily settled in, and that raises this bewildering attempt, or not bewildering attempt, this remarkable attempt rather, to address this bewildering question that starts the whole piece that we're reading, namely, what do you make of people who don't know their left hand and the right hand. And this opens up this extraordinary dialogue. So in a sense, it opens up the whole story of Jonah, which might seem deceptively simple. Whereas, I don't want to malign any other traditions, but some commentators in a standard way will interpret the 120,000 people who don't know their left hand from the right hand in a very reductive way. And they'll say, well, obviously this refers to 120,000 children, because that's what it obviously refers to, people who don't know their left hand and the right hand. Whereas Maximus begins to take us into this hermeneutically more open. I'm sort of dwelling on that word because that was a word that David brought to our attention as a response to reality as in communion as opposed to non-being. And by reducing the text and saying, okay, oh, this is all it means, in a sense, you're deadening the text and there's no possibility of light moving in. And this might be the best standard for hermeneutic interpretation. One can be reductive. One can also be, as we well know, suspicious and hostile and approach text without love. But when you approach a text and you begin to open it up and raise issues that, through a lovely irony, help to bring about your own atonement through understanding important aspects of a confrontation with potential nihilism and kind of confrontation with possibility of evil, then I think that's a sign that the remarkable hermeneutic interpretations are actually have some kind of truth attached to them, but not a single truth, because very playfully there's one that's brought up to different points of view. So I'm going to stop here, see if anyone else sort of, well, first of all wants to react to anything I've said, but also if this stirred any thoughts while you were reading Maximus's response to that question, which I haven't addressed yet. I just wanted to introduce it. The question of the left hand and the right hand.
Michael, I have a key question for you. But first, I remember that John Tietz used to speak of a non-eliminative reductionism. And he's talking about Nietzsche, where you have to select, but you're not eliminating that which you're not selecting. It's a mouthful, non-eliminative reductionism. But Michael, following what you're just talking about now, about reading, about extracting, about that kind of thing, on page 165, if you can turn, or if everyone, I want to ask you about a line, because I'm very, very curious what you think, because I've thought a lot about it. It's beginning 6 lines from the bottom of 165, page 165, beginning 6 lines from the bottom. And it's odd because Maximus here, well, for us, we are introduced to a truth which is enormous, immense, bigger than anything we've seen. But he says, if every figure or typos, type, derives from an expected reality, aletheia, truth, and etc., then he relates Jonah to Christ, right? Jonah here is understood as, in a way, a prefiguration, a type, right? We might call it a figure, we might call it a kind of an image or a kind of example or something like that. But the key thing is it anticipates, right? The type anticipates the truth, right? So when you're talking about how do we read it, how do we, I'm right with you. It's a deep question for me too. This constant reference to 3 days in the whale's belly, 3 days of Christ's tomb. Habesha people, Northeast African Orthodox people, they have what they call a Jonah fast just prior to the Great Lenten fast, right? But it's a 3 days in the whale's belly, so to speak, readying them for the effort to come. But Michael, this idea that the type derives from an expected reality, aletheia. Now, this is a massive, perhaps, upheaval in how we understand example or type, right? We often think of an example or type as something that has preceded us, right? This is a shifting of the center of truth to the future. The center of truth to what David Goa, what our tradition, but David Goa articulated a few weeks ago as being an eschatology of being, or a teleology of being, where the fullness of being, the fullness of Jesus Christ himself, so we're told, is then, as David Goa said earlier, everywhere present and filling all things. So this story is, in a weird way, an image of the future, an image of the future. And Maximus says at one point, we'll get to it, but he says that, typology is of the first revelation. Images or icons is of our revelation, our mortality, Jesus Christ, humanity, mortality, and so on. The truth, aletheia, is that which we do not know yet, none of us, but which we anticipate. So truth is always the fullness of what we have already. And this comes back to something that Goa distinguishes between presence and fullness. We've been talking a lot about presence, but what we have to keep in mind is, and David, if I'm not speaking for you, is that presence is looking towards fullness. So this is a strange, and not utopian, but strangely forward-centered. Forward is all eschatologically centered way of thinking about example and illustration. All right. What do you make of that?
Well, I'm really sorry.
Go on.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, David. You were about to jump in, I think.
Not me, no.
Oh, well, I see. Sorry, David. I thought you David Jennings. Were you about to?
Go on, Michael. Go on.
Sorry. Okay, pardon me.
No.
Sorry, I mistook the gesture. I thought you had your book up, and I thought maybe. Okay. I'm really. It sounds like a politician. I'm really glad you asked that question. Actually, is this I mentioned earlier that I'm disturbed by kind of literalism that closes down things at times, and I get a little nervous when I hear Christians of a certain kind, maybe some kinds of. Speaking carefully, some kinds of evangelical Christians who speak rather blithely about eschatology, and I think we're in really dangerous territory here. So I'm glad that you started to make some distinctions. But the term aletheia, and having it directed to the future, brings to mind a question, a kind of challenge to himself, hermeneutical challenge, that goes right to the heart of his method that Maximus brings up on the next page. I think it must be page 166 in the first full paragraph. And I won't read very far, but I'm just raising this to make an issue. And it goes right to this point of being hermeneutically multitudinous. That's not exactly, okay. And it says, nevertheless, someone still in doubt about this text might very well ask, okay, how is God being truthful when he gives this is, about truth in the future, when he gives the order for the city's destruction, yet does not destroy it? And again, let's not just think of Nineveh. Let's think of our condition right now, the condition of an individual, or certainly our culture, which is in a similarly bleak, non-being, nihilistic state of affairs. And this also gets back to Lorraine. I think we should be very, she has a kind of apprehension and worry about people who have easy answers. This is meant to be, and all of this. This is all caught up in a long, venerable tradition, which I'm bringing into question from the standpoint of my nascent understanding of a kind of more apophatic approach. So there might be some kind of I guess I'm tilting toward a kind of theological atonement, and I think this is really dangerous territory. But how does Maximus handle it? He handles it by suddenly offering a number of ways of interpreting what we took to be that truth, that instance of aletheia that was pointing forward. This is, of course, right at the very in the earliest texts of the New Testament that we have, earliest written ones by all accounts are Paul's letters, and he raises this issue right away. And when trying to predict the end times, and it quickly becomes kind of a standard view that no one knows these things. And so, but that doesn't get us off of the hook, because we have to make sense of revelation. We have to make sense of truth that is revealing itself. And this is an ongoing hermeneutical problem. And instead of rigidly holding to, as I see people often doing, to a single interpretation, Maximus is following in the tradition of other patristic thinkers, and someone like Augustine, who went through a dozen different interpretations of the first few verses of Genesis, and then ends by saying, because of all of the different difficult problems of being and time and so on and so forth, that we don't really have a very clear idea of what the text is saying. But that isn't a kind of skeptical standpoint. It's rather an introduction of a deep charity, that we're open to what it might say. And that's where we see this kind of flourishing imaginative hermeneutics that that Maximus treats us to. And that is a way. Sorry for that phone in the background. Just I hope it doesn't sound too loud. That comes back to this question of the left hand and the right hands. The left, because at first Maximus interprets this as, okay, look, what this means is there are people who, in their left hand, they're obsessed by sensual pleasures, and the right hand, they're conceited about all of their accomplishments. And this would certainly apply to a sophisticated cosmopolitan city like Nineveh, and certainly to our own position. And then he says, but we can also understand this in a more, potentially more sophisticated way. Just so you don't think I'm just creating all of this. I think this is on page 157, to backtrack just a little bit. And he opens up this vexing question about reason, which is quite perplexing. He says, okay, look, for those who don't know their left hand and the right hand, this is a positive thing. They, in a sense, have a kind of, they've opened themselves up to a kind of rational knowledge of the virtues, which is a precondition of atonement, a way of connecting. And this is very difficult. We're on the edge of the abyss at this moment, because it might seem to be opening up a kind of rationalism. But a certain phrase comes to mind that, if you excuse me quoting a great Puritan thinker, Milton, when he says that God made reason right. Reason is also free will or agency. And what he meant by that is our free, natural, unpolluted agency, or reason, God made right. And that's what he means when he says those who don't know their left hand from the right hand. So maybe in a sense, infant, it does hold true of infants, but that's not where it ends. Those who can recover something of their natural way of being also can be in touch with reason made right, with this kind of deep natural agency. And then he anticipates an obvious objection that people might make, namely that, look, we can, when we forget the measure and limit of our attempt, when we start referring back to our right hand again, start becoming conceited about our accomplishments, then we start forgetting about the measure of reason, and we start becoming irrational. So there's this contrast. So this is a long way of getting back to this point that, yes, we have to interpret and make sense of revelation, prophecy, and all this, but let's not be obsessed with our right hand. Let's not think that we, in some literalistic, unimaginative manner, be certain, because ultimately, knowing the Logos is ultimately a matter of grace, and it's this is getting back to a point that David was making. There's no necessity here. Necessity is a modal logic function that we attribute to propositions, things that we take to be true. By the way, the only necessary propositions there are the ones that are dead. Tautologies like A is equal to A, 1 + 1 is equal to 2, all bachelors are married. Those are the only necessary propositions we have. So it's a kind of a deadening approach. Okay, I'll stop there since I...
No, Michael.
A bit more of a
Continuing right along with your line of weighing the measure of reason and of necessity and of this kind of thing. What do you make of the last on page 170 over to 171? Maybe we can turn there. It's a very intriguing thing that Maximus brings up at the end, which I think touches on what Michael said, but what he's saying here is that, let me read it out. It's the last paragraph. Right? Think about reason, like Michael was just saying. Think about according one's own strength to one's right hand or left hand, as Michael was saying. Right? For if the word of Scripture represents a person as grieving over their booth and their gourd plant, that is over the flesh and carnal pleasure, but represents God as caring for Nineveh, then it's clear that, all right, that's all prelude. Here's the main substance. It is clear that whatever appears to be dear to God, is so much better and more honorable. Again, I lament the translation. So much better and more honorable than any existent thing precious to man, to a human being, much less anything non-existent, which seems to exist merely by the presumption of mistaken judgment. Maximus has talked more than once about mistakenness or misuse being the root of sin. Mistaken judgment, when actually it has no existential basis at all. Indeed, mere fantasy deceives the mind and, through passion, causes vain attachment to objects that do not exist, but provides no foundation of reality. Now, Michael, in my estimation, what he's saying here essentially is that what we usually assume is evil, what we usually accord, or what we usually claim as evil, doesn't exist. It's non-existent in the deepest sense of the word, right? but the mistaken judgment, the presumption of mistaken judgment, which seems to bring evil about, or seems to address it as a question, is part of how we reason. And I was thinking about this because it seems like when he's talking about the presumption of mistaken judgment, when it actually has no existential basis at all, mere fantasy deceives the mind and, through passion, causes vain attachment to objects that do not exist. So I was thinking, right, fantasy. Often we look at the realm of spiritual struggle in terms of imagination, which is then given form. And when we attend to that, and then we accompany that, then we are present to it. That's a healthy way of looking at it. But another way might be, we have fancy. It arises in illusion, right? We become passionately attached to that illusion, which becomes delusion, which becomes error. Now, in this, the work of reason is going on, right? The work of reason is going on. When we're thinking about, if we mistake the non-existence of evil, what are we doing? What are we doing when we see it here or there? If Maximus is right, if error has no foundation in reality, as he says, has no basis, it's air, it's in the air, right? David Goa once characterized in a moment heresy as hearsay. Hearsay, it's what flits in your ear in a moment and then passes through your mind and then whatever. But it distracts you. It distracts you. So, Michael, what do you make of this last paragraph of this text? What do you make of?
I hope I'm not.
What do you make of the strong claim, the strong metaphysical claim, but then also the kind of you've been talking about hermeneutics, about the hermeneutic involved and how Maximus sees the progression of our assumption that evil, or what is not dear to God, because he talks about whatever appears to be dear to God. We think what is not dear to God, i.e., not part of God, within God's arms, within God's gathering. What do we do then?
Yeah, just to sort of stage what I'm about to say, because it might be heretical, in my sort of nascent semi-delusional attempt to understand this new rich tradition, which seems to me to be so much more salutary than the traditions that I'm slightly more familiar with. The kind of core view, deifying view of loving your enemy obviously comes to mind. This is a phrase from Matthew, and everyone is familiar with the justification of the phrase to be, more like God himself that underlies it. I'm not meaning to be oblivious to that as the core spiritual message of Christianity and of our transformation, and of not, mistaking something that is unreal for something that is real. You can sense a big but coming, and here it is. Nevertheless, it seems to me that for those who are wavering in disbelief, in a kind of facile relativism where they would also go along with the idea that, well, nothing really exists. Any statement you make is true to this or that perspective. I think that they're in the kind of wasteland that Maximus brings to our attention, as I mentioned at the outset, very early in this piece. And anyone who's confronted a kind of, usually through a deep abysmal suffering, a kind of malevolence in someone, recognizes that there is an objectivity to morality. And I'm not, by the way, making a kind of case for Christianity as moralism, because that would go against the tenor of what I was earlier suggesting about us not, being in a state where we can't, rely on our own conceitful view of things. So let me try to bring this to a point by making the point that what I'm sort of thinking of, some sadistic guard in the gulag or something. This person is obviously delusional, and if they're behaving in a certain way, they're resting on error, committing themselves to a fantasy. And so they're in a state of enmity with anyone of goodwill, but you nonetheless have to love that person. But loving that person obviously doesn't entail fantasizing about the fact that they're fantasizing. I'm not trying to be clever here. I think all of us are finite after all. It's a function of mortal thought. And that's why, in a way, suffering is a kind of, this isn't intended to be a slick defense of the problem or dissolving of the problem of evil. But I think that without a kind of deep suffering and a kind of attendant evil in the world, finitude would be impossible. Finitude linked with agency and being an open reality that throws up challenges for us and throws us into the mouths of fish in a sense, more or less continuously. This would be a kitsch reality. And so to avoid a kitsch reality, I would like to say, and this is the heretical part, that, propositions designating this as evil might be wrong. A person who is committed to evil, that they're indulging in a fantasy, an illusion that could be tremendously damaging to themselves and to others, is a reality of finitude. And it's an inescapable reality. That's why this poignant tale is not one that ever has, can easily go away. It can. So I don't. What do you think? What do you think of that answer? I hope it's not too sophistical. Sounds like it might be.
I don't know. I have to think about how you just frame that. I have to think. Let me think about that, but let me ask you something else, Michael. And this is a question which may remain in our minds until next time, maybe. Okay, given predilection, given choice, given the potential comprehension in encounter of another person's choice, I think I'm with you. I think, insofar as I understand. If Maximus is right in this last paragraph, that what is dear to God is so much more existent than anything dear to a human being, i.e., so much more real. then when we are not with God, we are with unreality, you know. And it seems to me appropriate here to then characterize that condition of unreality as one in which we lie to ourselves.
Not necessarily, though. If you don't mind my saying, I think that's not a good, because we might be the victim of someone whose lies are harming, them and us and others.
Indeed, no, indeed. I was assuming agency. You're right.
Okay.
I was assuming agency, but fair enough. You're being more compassionate. I'm trying to establish a standard then through which we can apply compassion. Yeah. I want to ask.
I think we should have compassion, beyond so far as we're capable. We're not capable that far if we're thrown up against certain kinds of malevolence, especially if our interests are being violated. There's something horrible about being a victim, because you fall prey to the antithesis of loving your enemy, and loving your enemy. It's such a counterintuitive thing, and yet it's the bedrock. David Jennings might appreciate this if he's familiar with a similar sentiment by the great British jurist Lord Acton, who once illuminatingly said that the basis of presumption of innocence is love your neighbor. And I think a more profound statement, not that I'm more profound than Lord Acton, could be said if we say that the basis of our humane treatment of those who have even been found guilty after presumption of innocence, which is a very recent phenomenon, suggests a kind of practical application of loving your enemy. So no matter how malevolent someone is, I think that loving that person is a beautiful thing. Part of that involves recognition of the delusion that they've fallen into. But that they have fallen into delusion, and that delusions are consequential, that is a reality. That's sort of the point I was making. Otherwise, we can't even make the original point that evil is delusional.
I'm with you in that way. That's different language than I was just using. I was trying to set it on different footing, which is more clarity and illusion. More like that in terms of the spiritual life. So prior to or beyond the whole idea of judgment, of guilt, of loving despite, all that stuff. I'm trying to think more fundamentally, and not to disagree with anything you just said. I think that everything you just said has merit.
Yeah, no, I think you made a good point earlier when you were talking about justice in terms of appropriateness and restoration, and of course, in that, I guess this underlies what David was getting at when he says Christianity isn't a moralistic religion. How could it be with loving your enemy at the core of it? And I think this is something that a lot of I'm kind of going at evangelicals today, but there seem to be many, and you've actually been part of an email exchange with John Hudson and Steve Ogden about this, two Catholic friends of ours who have different views of capital punishment, and it's I think advocates of capital punishment probably are attached to a substantial notion of evil. So I'm entirely with your substantive point that no matter how vividly we paint the most malevolent person we can imagine, we're still enjoined to not view that person qua evil person as a substantive reality.
No, exactly.
I agree with that.
And I would say even the injunction to love thine enemy is saying, don't lie to yourself. this person's not your enemy. It's another human being.
Yeah.
That's who it is. Think about what's going on here. Back to the idea of encounter, which we brought up earlier. Back to the idea of what's involved when we are with somebody else. God is with us. God is not with us. This was brought up. Or to the earlier point too, about what if the person, if we think of unfolding as just, affirming everything someone says, that would be horrific, because people say they relate what they've undergone, and what they've undergone, as we've also heard, in terms of experience or suffering or what have you, it's a whole thing. But if we don't lie to ourselves and we don't say this person's our enemy or this person's story has to make sense, if we're just there, that's more what I'm trying to gesture towards with this distinction between the truth which is of a fullness to come, right? That's the other thing we have to remember. The truth, aletheia, is of a fullness to come, which we have an inkling of now. We taste it now, but it's of a fullness to come. That is contrasted to every story we tell ourselves about who we are or who the person we're seeing is. That's what we mean by lying. The stories we tell ourselves to make it comfortable, to make it easier, to make it what have you. That's what I was trying to get at. I wasn't trying to counter your kind of explanation of, or explication rather, it's better, explication of how we consider error and so on.
Well,
I'm another direction.
Yeah, I think I'm the one who was being a bit provocative, just because I really did want to sort of provoke an answer, and so
Michael,
so any kind of
I really appreciate the gravity with which you've spoken about this. I often, in an offhanded way, say, evil is just a real illusion, and but I think of, as I listen to you and talk about the malevolent, finding yourself in a place where there's a malevolent spirit and you're confined, you're captured. You can't get away from it. I'm teaching several people in prison, and one of them told me the other day that, he's only been in prison 11 years. And in 2 years, his first parole hearing comes up. But his parole officer said to him that she would not bring his case forward because he hadn't taken any of the courses that he should be taking to help you overcome the fact that you were convicted under the terrorism laws. He's done absolutely everything to get those courses, but they aren't allowed in the prison. So, it's a ridiculous kind of circumstance. But what I was thinking about as you spoke is Maximus himself. So he says this about, I love the last few pages here where he talks about these three kinds of law, the natural, and this is one where I think Orthodoxy departs from Roman Catholicism a bit, and maybe also from the Reformed tradition, in terms of natural law having such weight. Well, he gives it weight, but he also talks about scripture and grace and well-being. But we must remember, he's not, I don't know when he wrote this particular piece, but he was put upon a lot, hauled into trial, and in the end, killed by his own people.
Yeah.
His tongue cut out, his hand severed. No, he lived a long life because he had a pretty good boat, I guess, that he managed to escape in periodically. I don't think, if this is anything, I really appreciate what you've said, because we have to keep that in mind. This is not some soft notion of evil. Often Orthodoxy, because it never adopted the doctrine of original sin based on the narrative of the fall, often it's been criticized by Catholics as having a kind of soft notion of evil. I don't think Maximus has a soft notion of evil. But he is saying, and I think he's saying it as much to himself as to anybody else, you know, these people that I am engaged in this disputation about, associated with whether Jesus Christ has two natures or two wills or how all that works, and all the politicalization of it, he knew a lot about malevolent evil. I think what he's trying to do is remind himself and his monks, if you push back against the illusion in somebody that has led them to act malevolently towards you, and remember, these are monasteries. Monasteries are hothouses. So you've always got some jackass abbot or other monks who are playing mind games with you. Monasteries are full of that. The devil's running around all the time. I think what he's trying to get at is that there is a human being here who is lost in the belly of a whale. And try not to just see the belly of the whale that they're lost in. Don't just react to that. But it's a tough lesson. I mean, it's a tough thing for people that have, you know, and many of the people that Lorraine works with, who've had very, very tough experiences. It doesn't sound very comforting to say, love your damn enemy. I mean, that's kind of an inappropriate thing to say to some people, I think. It's a kind of blasphemy, given their circumstance. You have to walk with them and be in solidarity with them before any of that has any chance of emerging. So, well, I don't know if that speaks to what you were putting forward there, but I just wanted to tell you that I need to hear that myself, because I can too easily not take on board just how difficult some people's lives have been.
I think that was really wonderful. You encapsulated this piece by Maximus in that image when you say that we're all in the belly of the whale. I mean, that's a poignant thing to say, and a beautiful response to my. I hope it wasn't a heresy.
It's not a heresy at all. It's providing us with appropriate texture to this question of loving your enemy is not a simple thing. You know, in the Orthodox liturgy, at the end of the liturgy, after it's over and people are going forward they've had communion, they're going forward to kiss the hand cross and the icons and say goodbye. In my particular parish, they sing this particular piece, which, if I remember correctly, was actually composed just a day or two before the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which was give victory to the Orthodox people over their enemies. And I'm standing in line with the others and they sing this, and I said, what the hell is this? It's give victory to the Orthodox people over the enemy. Over the enemy, okay. But over their enemies, we've just gone to communion.
Yeah.
We don't have any enemies. And now you're reminding us again right away. And we're reducing evil and the malevolentness to particular people that don't look like us. So, yeah, thank you very much for that.
Now, I really want to thank everyone for today's session. This has really been a useful set of responses to bump up against, and I really enjoyed your explication earlier, David Jennings. And
Yeah, it was terrific.
I really enjoyed it. I know we're 15 minutes over, and probably Lorraine's got someone who's pulling at her to try to go away. She's got to get to a meeting. Are we going to cover on the two wills of Christ and the agony of Gethsemane before moving on? Or I had it that we were going to cover that tonight, but maybe I was wrong.
No, we already, that was part of our first session, believe it or not. We can return to it though, those two Opusculum.
No. Yeah, okay.
We refer to it vaguely.
Oh, okay. I must have got my reading wrong. Okay, that's great. I mean, I look forward to that.
No, wait. No, we're coming to that. We're coming to that, Jennings. We're coming to that.
So we'll do that in 2 weeks' time, and then move on to
No.
Oh,
no,
some later date.
We'll return to that kind of oddly, but much later. No,
Okay.
Next week is the Philokalia.
Great. The whole thing.
All of it, yeah. All 5. No, it's a Philokalia page is it's the first century on love. The first century on love, 53 to 64, I believe.
Yeah. Great.
First century on love. Yeah, so next time we'll gather the other ones, Jennings. We'll gather them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
The wills are a bit much for us right now, but yeah.
Okay.
All right, I'm gonna turn off the, pardon me, I'm gonna